The jungle breathes. Dense, suffocating green walls rise from volcanic soil still warm beneath the morning mist. Vines, thick as a man's arm, coil around ironwood trees that have stood for centuries, indifferent to empires. Somewhere in that maze of shadow and steam, Lieutenant Takeshi Yamamoto crouches behind a fallen log slick with moss, his Type 38 rifle resting across his knees. The wood is rotting, soft beneath his fingers. He can smell it, the sweet decay of the tropics, mixed with the salt wind pushing inland from Empress Augusta Bay. In the distance, through breaks in the canopy, he can see the American ships, gray hulls floating like iron mountains on water so blue it seems unreal. He counts them, 6 destroyers, 3 cruisers, and behind them, barely visible through the haze, the dark silhouette of a battleship. Yamamoto smiles. Let them come. The jungle is ready. Japan is ready. He does not yet know that in 48 hours, the jungle itself will cease to exist. The Pacific War had, by early 1944, become a campaign of islands, each one a universe of coral, mud, and blood. The Solomon Islands chain stretched like broken teeth across the sea, and each tooth had to be pulled. Guadalcanal had fallen to the Americans in February of 1943 after 6 months of savage fighting. The Japanese High Command, humiliated, had learned lessons from that defeat, or so they believed. The Americans fought with overwhelming material superiority, yes, but the jungle could be an equalizer. The jungle did not care about industrial capacity or assembly lines in Detroit. It rewarded patience, concealment, and the willingness to endure. Japanese forces dug into the volcanic ridges of Bougainville and New Georgia with religious devotion, transforming hillsides into fortresses of interlocking trenches, camouflaged pillboxes, and pre-sighted killing fields. Artillery pieces were hauled by hand through impossible terrain and hidden beneath canopies so thick that aerial reconnaissance photographed nothing but green. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Allow the American Marines to land. Let them push inland, away from their ships, away from their supply lines. Draw them into the jungle, where their tanks cannot maneuver, where their radios fail beneath the triple canopy, where every step forward is earned in blood. Then, when they are exhausted, bleeding, and blind, spring the trap. Converge from 3 sides, cut them off, annihilate them in detail. It had worked before, in China, in Malaya. It would work again. Japanese officers studied their maps by candlelight in bunkers that smelled of earth and sweat, tracing red arrows that converged on projected American positions. Victory was not a matter of if, but when. What they did not account for, what they could not account for, was that the jungle was not the battlefield. The jungle was simply in the way. Marine Corporal James Dietrich from Pennsylvania had been in the Pacific for 11 months. He had waded ashore at New Georgia, lost friends at Munda Point, and learned to sleep in foxholes half filled with water. He had stopped being surprised by anything: the size of the insects, the suddenness of tropical rain, the way a man could be alive and joking one moment and gone the next. But on the morning of January 17th, as his battalion prepared to push into the interior highlands, he was surprised by the ships. Not that they were there. The Navy was always offshore, a gray horizon of reassurance, but by what they were doing. The destroyers had moved closer, much closer than usual, threading through coastal reefs with a precision that seemed reckless. The cruisers had repositioned during the night, and the battleship, USS Massachusetts, someone said, though Dietrich couldn't confirm it, had trained her massive guns toward the Green Mountains inland. He watched a gunnery officer on the beach, shirtless in the heat, speaking into a radio handset while consulting a map spread across an ammunition crate. Another officer stood beside him with binoculars, scanning the ridgeline 3 miles away. Dietrich had seen naval gunfire before. He had heard the freight train roar of shells passing overhead, seen the distant flashes on hillsides. But something about this felt different. The precision, the patience, the way the ships seemed to be aiming, not just firing. In the Japanese positions, the first ranging shots arrived without warning. Yamamoto was eating cold rice pressed into a ball, the last of his rations from 2 days prior, when the world simply exploded. No whistle, no warning scream, just instant violence. A shell landed 60 meters to his left and transformed a stand of trees into splinters and smoke. The concussion wave lifted him and threw him against the back wall of his trench. His ears rang. He tasted blood. Another shell. Another. They were walking the fire, adjusting, searching. He had been taught that naval guns were inaccurate against land targets, that their flat trajectory made them ineffective in mountains. He had been taught wrong. The Americans had forward observers on the ridges, Marines with radios calling corrections in real time. They had spotter planes circling above the clouds. They had mathematics and tables and a logistics network that could deliver thousands of tons of high explosive shells to the exact grid coordinates where Japanese soldiers believed they were hidden.
The bombardment that preceded the American push into the interior of Bougainville lasted 7 hours. It was not a barrage in the traditional sense, not the chaotic drum roll of artillery that churned earth without purpose. This was surgery. 6-inch and 8-inch shells, some weighing as much as a man, descended in sequences calculated to collapse trenches, detonate ammunition stores, and shatter human psychology. A Japanese position would be struck, then struck again 30 seconds later to kill those who emerged to help the wounded, then struck a third time a minute later to kill those who had waited. Fire control officers aboard the cruisers worked with the dispassionate efficiency of accountants, marking targets destroyed, marking targets suppressed, moving to the next grid square. The jungle, that vast green fortress that Japanese commanders had counted on, became a liability. Trees amplified shrapnel, vines trapped men trying to flee. The canopy that had hidden gun positions so effectively now trapped smoke and heat, turning hillsides into ovens. Yamamoto survived the initial bombardment by crawling into a collapsed bunker and covering his head. When the shelling moved to the next ridge, he emerged into a landscape he did not recognize. The jungle was gone, not damaged, gone. Trees stood as blackened poles. The ground was cratered, smoking, littered with debris he could not identify. Of his platoon of 32 men, he found 9. Some were wounded, most were in shock, staring at nothing. The radio was destroyed. The carefully prepared fields of fire, the camouflaged machine gun nests, the interlocking trenches, all meaningless. He tried to organize a withdrawal, but there was nowhere to withdraw to. Every route inland was pre-sighted, every valley a kill zone. He heard the bombardment continue to the west, then to the north, methodically erasing the jungle sector by sector. And then, through the ringing in his ears, he heard something new. Voices. English. American voices, casual and loud, advancing through terrain that no longer existed to conceal them. The Americans expected resistance. They moved cautiously, rifles ready, experienced enough to know that bombardment never killed everyone. But what they found was not resistance, it was wreckage. Japanese positions that had been invisible from 50 feet away were now exposed craters. Machine guns lay half-buried, their barrels bent. Bodies, when they found them, were often impossible to count as individuals. Dietrich moved through the ruins with his squad, and the primary emotion he felt was not triumph but unease. This did not feel like combat. It felt like walking through the aftermath of something biblical. They found survivors, dazed, unarmed, stumbling through the smoke. Some surrendered. Many did not, choosing instead to detonate grenades clutched to their chests. But there was no coordinated defense. The trap had been disarmed before it could be sprung. Japanese military doctrine had been built on the concept of seishin, spirit, will, the unquantifiable force of a warrior's resolve. It was believed that superior spirit could overcome material disadvantage, that a soldier willing to die could defeat a soldier who wished to live. This philosophy had been tested in China, where Japanese forces repeatedly defeated larger but poorly equipped armies. It had been validated in Malaya and the Philippines, where aggressive tactics shattered colonial defenses. But in the Solomon Islands, against the United States Marine Corps supported by the United States Navy, seishin encountered something it had no answer for: industrial logistics. The shells that erased the jungle had been manufactured in foundries in Pennsylvania and Indiana. They had been transported across the Pacific in cargo ships built in Kaiser shipyards at a rate of 1 per day. They had been stored in floating arsenals that could sustain bombardment for weeks without resupply. The Americans did not need superior spirit, they had superior mathematics.
Yamamoto and his surviving men retreated deeper into the island's interior, where the naval guns could not reach. They were not alone. Thousands of Japanese soldiers, scattered and leaderless, filtered into the central highlands. They had no supplies. The supply dumps had been located near the coast in positions that were now obliterated. They had no heavy weapons. Those had been abandoned. They had no communication with headquarters. What they had was hunger and the creeping realization that they had been preparing for the wrong war. They had trained to ambush Americans in the jungle. They had not trained to be hunted by Americans who simply removed the jungle first. The American advance continued with a momentum that shocked both sides. Positions that Japanese planners estimated would take weeks to reduce fell in days, then hours. The Marines moved inland, not in a grinding push, but almost as if on maneuver, advancing to objectives and finding them already destroyed. Naval gunfire support became a science. Forward observers with the radio call sign Thunder would identify a target, a bunker, a suspected artillery position, a trench line. Within minutes, shells would arrive. Corrections would be radioed, more shells, then silence, then Marines walking through rubble. The Navy's contribution was so dominant that it became routine, almost boring in its efficiency. Gun crews aboard cruisers fired, reloaded, fired again with the mechanical rhythm of factory workers. They played cards between fire missions. They complained about the heat and the quality of the coffee. They did not see what their shells did. They did not need to. By January 28th, 11 days after the bombardment began, organized Japanese resistance on Bougainville had effectively ceased. Pockets remained, isolated groups of soldiers hiding in caves, launching nighttime raids, dying slowly of disease and starvation. But the trap had failed. The grand encirclement had never materialized. The jungle fortress had been revealed as just jungle, and then not even that. American casualties for the operation were, by Pacific War standards, light. Japanese casualties were catastrophic, not because of close combat, but because entire units had been destroyed by fire from ships they never saw. In official records, the battle is listed as a victory. In private letters, Japanese officers described it as maho, bewitchment, a kind of dark sorcery that defied understanding. Yamamoto was captured in early February, found unconscious from malaria near a stream bed. He was taken to a field hospital, treated, and eventually shipped to a prisoner of war camp in Australia. In interviews conducted after the war, he described the bombardment in language that did not sound military. He spoke of it as an earthquake, a typhoon, an act of nature. When pressed by interrogators on Japanese tactics, he became quiet. Then he said something that was noted in the report. "We thought we would fight Marines. We did not know we would fight the ocean." There is an object, mundane and easily overlooked, that appears repeatedly in the accounts of that campaign.
Not a weapon, not a symbol, a ration can. American sea rations came in small olive drab tins, stamped with instructions and menu codes. They contained beef hash, beans, crackers, cigarettes, toilet paper, matches, and, improbably, a tiny packet of instant coffee. Japanese soldiers who found these cans, either looted from captured positions or scavenged from abandoned marine foxholes, were transfixed, not by the food, though they were starving, by the abundance, the casual, thoughtless abundance. Each can was a self-contained unit of survival, packaged for one man for one meal. And the Americans had millions. They threw them away. They complained about them. They traded them. They buried them in the mud and walked away. To Japanese soldiers subsisting on rice balls and roots, the sea ration became a kind of talisman, a physical proof of something incomprehensible. An enemy that could afford to waste food was an enemy that could afford to waste shells, to waste fuel, to waste lives if necessary. It was not satiation they were fighting. It was geometry. It was scale. The Marines who advanced through the shattered jungle found those same cans in Japanese positions, opened and scraped clean, the labels studied with fascination. Dietrich found one in a bunker, the label smoothed out and folded carefully, tucked into a Japanese soldier's notebook. He kept it, though he could not say why. It seemed important, a piece of evidence. By March 1944, Bougainville was secured. The airfield at Torokina, the strategic objective of the entire campaign, was operational. American bombers used it to strike Rabaul, the major Japanese base to the north. The naval guns that had erased the jungle moved on to other islands, other targets. Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima. The pattern repeated. The Japanese would fortify, the Americans would bombard. The jungle, the coral, the volcanic rock, none of it mattered. What mattered was the industrial capacity to deliver explosives at a rate that made resistance not heroic, but obsolete. In Tokyo, the implications were understood but not spoken. The war was not being lost in battles, it was being lost in factories, shipyards, and logistics tables written in languages the Japanese command could not read. Every ship sunk could be replaced by the Americans within weeks. Every shell fired was already manufactured and in transit. The mathematics were inexorable. But to admit this was to admit that Seishin had failed, that the spirit of the warrior was powerless against the spirit of the assembly line. So the war continued. More islands, more traps, more jungle fortresses, and the naval guns followed, patient and thorough, erasing each one in turn. Yamamoto, in his prison camp, learned English. He read American newspapers and magazines provided by the Red Cross. He read about factory production numbers, about Liberty ships and Sherman tanks rolling off lines in quantities that seemed fictional. He read about cities in America that existed solely to build bombers, about women working in shipyards, about a nation that had transformed itself into a weapon while still eating well, still going to movies, still complaining about rationing that would have seemed like luxury to any Japanese citizen. He read these things and understood, finally, what he had been fighting. Not Marines, not even America, but an idea made physical, that a society organized around abundance could, when threatened, convert that abundance into overwhelming violence without ever ceasing to be abundant. The jungle could not stop that. Nothing could stop that. The ration can, that small olive tin, became his symbol for the entire war. He kept one, though he was not sure how he had acquired it. Stamped on the bottom was a date and a code, 1943, Chicago, Illinois, a city he had never heard of, a place that made food for soldiers and shipped it across an ocean to be eaten and thrown away in a jungle on an island whose name most Americans could not pronounce. That was the war.
Not speeches or flags or dying proclamations, just Chicago making cans.
The jungle on Bougainville eventually grew back. Craters filled with water and became ponds. Vines covered the rusted metal. Trees sprouted from the wreckage of bunkers. By 1950, you could walk through those hills and see nothing but green, hear nothing but birds. The jungle reclaimed its territory, as it always does. But the lesson remained, written in the records and the memories and the quiet corners of military academies where officers study what happened and why. The lesson is not complex. It is almost embarrassingly simple. You cannot hide from an enemy that can afford to destroy your hiding place. You cannot outlast an enemy that treats ammunition like water. You cannot defeat an enemy whose wealth is so great that waste becomes a tactic. The Marines who fought there rarely spoke of it in heroic terms. When they gathered in later years at reunions and memorial services, they spoke of the jungle, the heat, the fear, but mostly they spoke of the ships, the vast, patient ships that followed them from island to island, turning mountains into gravel so that young men from farms and cities could walk forward and live. They did not feel like conquerors. They felt like survivors of a process, witnesses to a kind of violence that was mechanical and absolute. The Navy called it fire support. The Marines called it salvation. The Japanese called it the end of a world. And in the end, that is what it was. Not a battle, not even a campaign, but the collision of two philosophies made flesh, one that believed spirit could transcend material reality, and one that believed material reality, properly organized, could render spirit irrelevant. The jungle was caught between them and ceased to exist. The trap was sprung on those who set it, and the gray ships moved on, their guns still loaded, their holds still full, their course already plotted toward the next island, the next jungle, the next enemy who did not yet understand what was coming. The ocean, patient and indifferent, carried them forward. History followed in their wake, written in shell craters and sea ration tins, and the quiet disbelief of men who had believed the jungle would save them, until it simply vanished beneath the weight of American abundance-made artillery. The lesson, if there is one, is not about courage or tactics. It is about the terrifying simplicity of scale, that freedom, when industrialized, does not argue, it simply buries.